Hello, it's Monday. Can't be more excited than me. I got up, I put makeup on, I got my earrings on, I fixed my hair, got jeans on, not pajama pants. I'm just glad to be out of my routine of sitting in a chair and checking your work and going to the computer, and spending a lot of my days doing that kind of work. My family call this my teacher corner of the kitchen, and they're right. I look forward to this, and I'm missing you guys. Even though some of y'all are big stinkers, I still miss you. We want to kind of get, though. Sorry, my cat's going crazy in the dining room. We want to kind of get into our story this morning. We are still in Holes. And one of the things that I talked about with you guys last week is that Holes is a very familiar story for quite a few of you. You've either read the book, you've watched the movie. And the storyline at this point is pretty much dead on. It's one is following the other pretty much. But one of the things with reading class, and that's what this is, it is reading class, is that we are not just looking at stories. We are looking at skills that need to be achieved using stories. And that's what I love about being able to teach this reading class in this manner. I love the idea of getting kids hooked on books and becoming lifelong readers using the skill that we need to learn as part of our curriculum. And so that's what we are doing. One of the things that I noticed when I picked up my paper pencil test at school last week and went through those and looked at journal entries for students who do not have internet access, or just kids who didn't want to do the Google Classroom. Their scores just were not as good as your all's. And I'll be extremely honest, there was a 13-point difference when I looked at the average of my scores with internet versus my scores of kids who were not watching the Google Classroom feeds every day. And that's because they're just kind of going through the motions and going through the story. They don't have me there really keep going back to this end in mind, talking about, well, what is that quality? What exactly is a quality, for one thing? And so when you are thinking, oh my gosh, can't watch Miss Kim one more minute, I want you to think about how much better your scores are than your counterparts or your classmates. That's what a counterpart is, someone you would see as your equal. For me, a counterpart is my teachers in my classroom. We are all on the same level. We all have the same education. We're all doing the same kind of job. So your counterparts is your classmates. You guys are all in this together. You are students. You're all roughly the same age, so you have some commonalities there. But let me get back on subject here. So we want to make sure that we take a good look at what our end in mind is, because test day is Friday. And we'll have another test on Google Classroom. And I tell you what, I am half tempted to build all my tests in Google Classroom next year when we get back into regular classroom. It was so much quicker for me to score those. And I think it's because I was able to read the writing. A lot of times I spend a lot of time looking at those, trying to decipher what some of you guys have written. And as well, it was a lot quicker for me to type my responses in beside, like if you missed something, to type it than it was to handwrite everything out. So I'm kind of getting on this Google Classroom bandwagon here just a little bit. So don't be surprised if you see this format swing back around to you guys next year. All right, so our end in mind for this year is identify qualities of the main character by analyzing his thoughts, his words, and or his feelings. And one of the things that that we recognized with Stanley on last Friday was that a quality we gave him for that particular day's reading was impatient. And one of the reasons that we gave him that, or some of our evidence that supported that, was in digging his hole, he just jumped in there and just really tried to start digging the hole. He didn't think about the parameter of the hole. And hear that math word, the parameter of the hole, and how he needed to make sure that the dirt that he was digging out went beyond that parameter. And by just being impatient and jumping in there and doing just those few, initial digs, it dawned on him, oh crap, how big is this hole really gonna be? And when he started looking, he realized that he was going to have to redig that dirt again and get it outside of his circle. So his impatience of wanting to get started and not really thinking through this hole set him back some in time. So it created extra work for him to do. Now, I'm guilty of that myself sometimes. And I would say that I am impatient, and so would my family, I'll be honest, especially when certain circumstances. How many of you that are video gaming crazy right now find yourself being impatient when you're having to share that game system and you really want to get on and play? You're supposed to meet your friends at a certain time to interact and play with one another. Or you're in a game where you're playing simultaneously with someone and they aren't doing what you think they should do, and you are very impatient with them. So when we think about it, that is a quality that a lot of us have. And so we want to keep that in mind as we continue with our reading today. Now, our vocabulary, let me kind of come on this side. Is recycle, and that is to use again. My oldest son has been here for a month from Colorado. He came for his sister's wedding, and he's been kind of stuck here. The university where he works is on shutdown, so he's like, why go back? And he's been doing some work from here, but he was complaining last night about his brother's room. He said, I need to start recycling these cans. He said, because I have enough money if I did that to pay off my car right now. And he's probably right. His brother's a little bit of a gom sometimes. Increasingly, that is more and more. So if you live in a small space or a small house, it is probably becoming increasingly more difficult to stay nice to each other, especially when the weather is cold and you're all cramped up. Collapse is to fall down, and I'm always joking about this bad hip of mine, that if I'm not careful, I might collapse on the hip and fall down. Retrieved is fetched. Humiliating is embarrassing. Despicable is terrible. It's where something is beyond just bad. It's like, oh my gosh, this is horrendous. Staggered is walked unsteadily. If you've ever watched Live PD, and my family is hooked on Live PD, sometimes the police officers will ask people that they pulled over to walk a straight line, and they are unable to do that. And we've used the ED in the past tense. So I would have to say, while watching Live PD, the criminal staggered along the roadside and was unable to walk the straight line. So they are unsteady on their feet. So that's what staggered means. And survive is to stay alive. So it's at whatever cost that it costs, whether there is a movie, and I can't remember the name of it, but but I think the premise of the movie was that as a gentleman was mountain climbing, and he fell down between a crevice in the mountain, and somehow his arm was lodged and he couldn't get out. And he stayed there for days and days and days, and he became weaker and weaker because he didn't have food and he didn't have water. And when he looked at all of the materials that he did have, he had a knife. And so he decided that for him to survive or to stay alive, he was going to have to climb out of that crevice on his own. And so what do you think that he did? Yeah. He created a tourniquet around his arm so that he wouldn't bleed to death. And he took that knife, and without any kind of painkiller or anesthetic, he cut his own arm off so that he could survive. He did whatever it took to make sure that he lived for another day. And through all of the pain that he had to endure doing that, I can't even talk about it, just is so beyond my comprehension, that he decided that it was worth it to survive. And so he did what was necessary. So that's where we are right now. We want to take out day 3 questions, and I think that we already, let me scoot my chair back a little bit more so my head's not cut off. I'm pretty sure that we had broken the questions down, but just in case we had not, let's do that real quick, okay? So let me give you a minute to do that. I need to. And as you're finishing with that, I'd like you to go ahead and turn to page 35. All right, so write on your team talk that your evidence from today is going to come from pages 35 through pages 40. That's what I've got written down here. So I will stop reading on page 40. So as I'm reading, think about those questions, and then where is your evidence going to come that will support those? All right, here we go. Well, the next time the water truck came, it was driven by Mr. Pedansky, who also brought sack lunches. Stanley sat with his back against a pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. Missing an apple or it would be a school bag lunch day, a lunchroom special. "How you doing?" asked Magnet. "Not real good," said Stanley. "Well, the first hole's the hardest," Magnet said. And Stanley took a long, deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others, and the sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet, but he didn't know if he had the strength to stand up. He thought about quitting, and he wondered what they would do to him. What could they do to him? Well, his clothes were soaked with sweat. In school, he had learned that sweating was good for you. It was nature's way of keeping you cool. So why was he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. "Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom?" he asked Magnet. And Magnet gestured with his arms to the great expanse around them, and he said, "Pick a hole, any hole," he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. And behind him he heard Magnet say, "But first, make sure nothing's living in it." Well, after leaving Myra's house, Ilya wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself down by the wharf. He sat on the edge of a pier and stared down into the cold black water. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. Even if she didn't love him, couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was as empty as a flower pot. And some men were gathering on another dock, and he went to see what was going on, and a sign read, "Deckhands wanted, free passage to America." Well, he had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him up aboard, and the captain could see that Ilya was a man of great strength. Not everybody could carry a full-grown pig up the side of a mountain. Well, it wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading out across the Atlantic that he suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain, and he felt terrible. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought that was a lot of nonsense, and he felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. Well, Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You're finished?" Stanley asked enviously, and Zero said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and deep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Well, Zero pulled himself up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his perfectly dug hole, spat in it, then turned and headed back to the camp compound. "Zero's one weird dude," said Zigzag. And Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck and a big, round head with wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down on his neck like it was on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat into his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into his hole and return to the camp compound. Stanley kept digging. Why, his hole was almost up to his shoulder, although it was hard to tell exactly where ground level was because his dirt piles completely surrounded the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up and out of the hole. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was stained with blood from his hands, and he felt like he was digging his own grave. In America, Ilya learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and, most important, think for herself. She and Ilya often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Ilya worked hard, but bad luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sounds like Stanley and those sneakers. Well, he remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America, and Ilya was forever looking for him. Well, he'd walk up to complete strangers and ask if they knew someone named Zeroni or had ever heard of anyone named Zeroni. No one did. Ilya wasn't sure of what he'd do if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up a mountain and sing the pig lullaby to him? Well, after his barn was struck by lightning for the third time, he told Sarah about his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should leave me and find someone who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Ilya. Sarah smiled. "Sing me the pig lullaby." and he sang it for her, and her eyes sparkled. That is so pretty. What does it mean? And Elliot tried his best to translate it from Latvian, I think, into English, but it wasn't the same. Well, it rhymes in Latvian, he told her. I could tell, said Sarah. And a year later, their child was born. And Sarah named him Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats, spelled backwards. And Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that they rhymed. And every night she sang it to little Stanley. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was as soft as the skies, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, crying to the moon, if only, if only. Well, Stanley's hole was as deep as his shovel, but not quite wide enough on the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt, then raised it up and flung it into a pile. He laid his shovel down on the bottom of his hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it and only had to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before it could lie flat across his hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching and felt a strange sense of pride at being able to show Mr. Sir or Mr. Pedanski that he had dug his first hole. He put his hands on the rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he just didn't have any strength. He was trapped in his hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. Stanley, he heard Mr. Pedanski call. Well, using his shovel, he dug 2 footholes in the hole wall, and he climbed out to see Mr. Pedanski walking over to him. I was afraid you'd fainted, Mr. Pedanski said. You wouldn't have been the first. I'm finished, Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap back on his head. All right, said Mr. Pedanski, raising his hand for a high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't have strength. And Mr. Pedanski lowered his hand and looked down at Stanley's hole. Well done, he said. You want to ride back? Stanley shook his head. I'll walk. I think that I would have taken a ride. Well, Mr. Pedanski climbed back into the truck without filling Stanley's canteen. And Stanley waited for him to drive away and then took another look at the hole. And he knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud, nevertheless. He sucked up his last bit of saliva and spat. That's where the reading stops today. So I want you to make sure that in your journals that you guys are adding the textual evidence. Some of the pages that I looked at from the other kids, is some of them are just trying to make really short answers. And there were a lot of 60s and 70s in there. So make sure you go back in, that you find where the textual evidence should be. And I'll see you back here in a few minutes. Bye, guys.